Okay then. See, we are recording. All right, this is like the third time that I've started recording this. The last one I got like 2 minutes into it and then realized after everything else was figured out, I didn't have a beverage. Can you imagine me trying to do a Q&A without a beverage? But I got it now. So, my woman and her mama are not here right now. So I'm going to take advantage of the relative quiet and solitude to record this Q&A. And it is kind of unfortunate that my sweetheart isn't here because this may be the last long beard episode that I do. I mean, it would be nice if it could be braided with the Mjolnir bead and everything, that I could like toss around ostentatiously. But I'm probably going to have this cut off soon because I'm starting to look for another job. Driving a forklift for a trucking company, just too hectic, too frustrating, too many hours, too much work, just stress and aggravation. And so I'm going to look for another job. So the beard has to come off so I can look relatively normal. And then after I find another job, maybe I'll grow it back again because for some reason, I do not fully fathom my woman actually likes for me to have a long braided beard. But with that as kind of an unnecessary intro, I will point out that 178, as far as I can tell, is not prime because it seems to be 2 times 89. Is that right? 2 times 89? 89 is prime, I'm pretty sure. So I suppose we got like the middle path number of questions. Not too many, not too few. Not so much that it's like torture, but not so few that it's self-indulgence. That kind of thing. So I suppose I should just wade right into this and start answering questions. Let's see here. First question is from Romeo. And Romeo says, you were an ascetic monk largely removed from the civilized world and mainstream American society for 30 years. That is a long time. I imagine there were a few cultural or historical developments that occurred during that time that either pleasantly surprised, disappointed, or shocked you when you eventually caught up with things. Were there any historic events that transpired in those 30 years that shocked or surprised you once you heard about them after the fact? For example, the fall of the Soviet Union, 9/11, etc. Well, the fall of the Soviet Union happened before I even went to Burma. I was a monk at the monastery in California, and of course I heard nothing about it. And then I'm talking to this American guy, and he just happens to mention in passing in this sentence, ever since the Second Russian Revolution. And I'm like, what do you mean the Second Russian Revolution? At first, I'm just thinking maybe it was just some kind of student protest or something. And he says, yeah, the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore. It's Russia again now. They've got the old Russian flag and everything. So that was kind of a shocker, I suppose. I think it was more amazing to me that I hadn't heard anything about it until weeks afterwards while still living in America than that it actually happened. I mean, that it actually happened was good because, of course, a lot of Americans just naively thought, well, the Cold War is over. America and Russia can be friends now. Of course, you've got people in the shadows that did not want the Cold War to end. Oh well. Also, with regard to 9/11, I remember when that happened, I was living in a cave in Burma, and these two Burmese guys came, and one of them wanted to tell me about something that happened in America, and the other one says, oh, don't tell him, it'll just make him feel bad or something. But then I said, yeah, go ahead and tell me. And then he says that a rich Arab crashed a plane into the World Trade Center. And that's about as much information as I got at first. And it just gradually, over a period of weeks afterwards, I started gradually getting more information from various sources until I finally got my mother, who was still alive back then, to send me newspaper clippings. And it's kind of an interesting phenomenon to me that she sent me newspaper clippings in equal amounts from two events. One was 9/11, the planes and all that. And the other one was that the high school in my hometown was partially burnt down. And it's sort of like, small things up close appear big and big things far away appear small. So, I mean, to her psychology, I guess, she just kind of considered them to be of equal import. One is happening right there in town, which is kind of big news. Half the building, well, it was like two buildings. And so one of the buildings burnt down. But I mean, I know I've read so much history that it would take really something to shock or surprise me in history. I mean, a lot of the time you don't really notice how momentous something is until afterwards, because there's all these after effects and side effects, ramifications and all that, so that you think something is important or unimportant now, but then later on you see that you were mistaken because you could not foresee, that this was just starting a chain reaction, for example. So, for example, like the protests in Iran right now, or Iran, I mean, that could just be totally momentous, or it could just be squelched by the government and flash in the pan. We don't know yet. So, I mean, that was really it. I mean, when I was in Burma, I was more attuned to like Burmese national news, which is mostly propaganda, but still you pick up little things, like the military dictator gets overthrown, on charges of corruption or something, as though the people that replaced him weren't equally corrupt. So let's see here. I guess, I mean, that's about it, really. There's the historic event that transpired over those 20 years, really, because after 20 years in Burma, I started coming back to America and kind of commuting back and forth every few years, sometimes less than a year. I'd stay in America for 6 months and then go back to Burma again. So, I was sort of more in touch with what was going on in America after like 2011. But still, I don't know, it's nothing really shocked or surprised me other than just the surprise of hearing weeks after the fact that the Soviet Union had collapsed. That was probably like the big surprise for me. 9/11 happened, I found out about it so gradually that, there was no big shocker happening. Obama becoming president, I mean, at the time, it was just, we got a new president. But, after, in retrospect, you see that, I mean, it was like a no-win scenario choosing between Obama and Mitt Romney. I mean, but Obama was kind of a turning point in American history, I think. He was sort of turning kind of away from America and towards globalism and just sort of managed decline of the United States and so forth. But I guess I answered the question well enough. And so I'm going to move on to Romeo's second question, which is kind of similar. Were there any developments in American culture that surprised you, or things that you expected to develop a certain way but didn't? For example, the death of MTV as a showcase for cool music videos, the growth and dominance of hip-hop over rock music, etc. Well, I mean, I really wasn't much into MTV. I despised television when I was a young man. Didn't own one. I made a special point of not owning a television since I was a teenager. Although sometimes, like in college, I'd have a roommate who had a TV. So there you are. You got TV, and he'd be watching plastic surgery updates right at mealtime, this kind of thing. The growth and dominance of hip hop. I mean, it started off with rap music. And rap music was before I became a monk. Late 80s, there were already people rapping. I think some of the first famous rap music was from white people, like Wordy Rapping Hood from Tom Tom Club, or Rapture from Blondie. They're just, I mean, it already existed. They didn't start it or anything, but they just kind of brought it into the mainstream, being white liberal females, I guess. But yeah, rap music, that's just, my brother described rap music fairly well when he said that it's music for people who can't play instruments, can't write music, and can't sing. So hip hop maybe is an improvement over that, but I don't know. I mean, before that it was disco. So I guess like the dominance of rap music and then hip hop, it's just sort of indicative of cultural decline. But that's just my take on it. But the things about America that surprised me the most when I came back to America in 2011, trying to live as a free-range bhikkhu in America. Not just staying at a monastery, but just flinging myself out into the world like I did. One of the things that surprised, or was kind of surprised me, is just how digital everything already was. Everything was digital. Everyone has a cell phone, for example. The internet, of course, was a big deal. I mean, the internet was one of the most momentous changes in Western culture, world culture, during the time that I was a monk. So that would definitely be up there. And another thing is just sort of people just got softer and kind of more polite, more gentle, more feminized, essentially. So American culture did become more feminized during the 20 years that I was absent. I remember seeing, anyone riding a bicycle in Bellingham, Washington was wearing a helmet. And finally, I just asked them, is it like a law now that you have to wear a helmet when you ride a bicycle? But no, it's just that for some reason, everyone in town that rode a bicycle had a helmet on. And that kind of surprised me a little bit, just kind of the softening and weakening of sort of American culture to some degree. It was noticeable. It was a noticeable change. But for the most part, things really didn't change all that much between like 1990 and 2012, like that general time span. Hairstyles pretty much stayed the same. They got a little bit more elaborate with like green hair and that kind of stuff. Clothing styles, just like even music wasn't all that different. It really, the main changes were everything was digital and things were a little softer. And of course you had internet. So I think I'm just going to move on to Romeo's third question. Any cultural touchstones that you regret missing out on? And then for an example, he has the O.J. Simpson trial. Yeah, I was just kicking myself the whole time I was in Burma. Man, I just missed out on that O.J. Simpson trial. No, not really. It's probably a good thing that I did miss the O.J. Simpson trial. That happened like in my early years in Burma, I think. Yeah, I remember some Americans. I met this American couple that were telling me about O.J. Simpson and Kurt Cobain dying that I'd never even heard of. He's from my hometown of Aberdeen, Washington. But, he was like an international phenomenon and then died before I even found out that he existed. Probably went to the same high school. He was just this little freshman nobody when I was a senior, probably. Yeah, I'm kind of grateful that I missed out on the O.J. Simpson trial, and the Michael Jackson trial stuff. Yeah, I caught a little bit of that. I would visit my parents in Aberdeen like once every 4 or 5 years. So my father watched CNN regularly, pretty much just had the TV on CNN all the time. That was back when it still was kind of balanced news to some degree. It hadn't, the mainstream media hadn't just completely gone leftist propaganda yet at that time. So I'd catch a little bit of this stuff. But it wasn't really important to me. It's mainly like interesting from an anthropological point of view. an incipient historical point of view, maybe. Sort of like maybe we're seeing history with this or that or the other thing. And I think we are kind of in historical times right now. But yeah, there's no cultural touchstones that I regret missing out on other than maybe like the Wild West days of the early internet. That could have been interesting. But I think I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Stellar Supreme, etc., 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 etc. And he says, did Tirachana Vija mean sued, as in pseudo-intellectual, or would there be a better Pali word for translating that modern term? Well, an intellectual, that might be somebody like Pandita. That a Pandita is like a learned, intelligent person. And sued, Tirachana Vija literally means animal knowledge. So it's not referring to like fake intellectuality. It's referring to just worldly stuff that really doesn't have anything significant to do with Dhamma, and that a monk should not be wasting his time with this kind of stuff. It could be nuclear physics. It could be like intricacies of foreign policy, this kind of stuff. But still, from a Buddhist point of view, it's Tirachana Vija, or animal knowledge, because it's just worldly samsaric stuff that does not really help you to become enlightened. So pseudo, probably the word micha would come closer than Tirachana. Tirachana just means animal. Micha, like in micha diti, wrong view. So it can mean wrong or false. So micha, false. Pseudo means like false or like imitation. So, like a micha pandita, maybe. I don't know. If there really would be like an exact corresponding term in Pali to a pseudo-intellectual. You could just have like some vain, conceited scholar. They had those in the Buddhist time. And, I'm not exactly sure what the word would be, but pseudo would probably be the closest you'd come to pseudo, at least in like regular, like normal Pali language, would be micha, which just means like false or fake, wrong, like wrong speech. So, or musawada, that would be wrong speech, wouldn't it? Yeah. But I do think micha would be more like pseudo in Pali. And I don't know what a pseudo-intellectual would be. It's like a micha pandita, something like that. Panditika, is just sort of like adding like this diminutive at the end of pandita to sort of denigrate and imply that he's like a fake scholar. Like samanaka is sometimes used, people sort of looking down on the shaven-headed ascetics. They're Brahmins or something. They look down on the shaven-headed ascetics, so they throw in this diminutive suffix, which kind of implies that the person is just sort of like a ersatz philosopher kind of a thing. So something like that, but I don't think that there really would be an exact corresponding term in Pali for a pseudo-intellectual. And I'm going to move on to the next question, which is from Jimmy Lad. After looking to make sure, we are recording again. It's just amazing that I actually started this video without having a beverage. That's just crazy. So, Jimmy Lad says, evil done in perfect mindfulness. So that's the title. It's like the heading of his question. Evil done in perfect mindfulness. And he says, when you say that Buddhist ethics are to do with the intention, surely this has limits. And I do resent him calling me surely. Let's get back to the question here. When you say that Buddhist ethics are to do with the intention, surely this has limits. Like if someone theoretically committed a horrific crime like incest with their mother or murder, but maintained perfect mental equanimity while doing it, would they be free of all karmic consequences? You gotta consider human psychology, that Dhamma really is attuned to human psychology. Morals in Buddhism are more a matter of psychology than some celestial decree. And so, I mean, you got to think, how could somebody commit a horrific crime with perfect equanimity? You know, it's like I was thinking of like Oedipus, who murdered his own father and married his own mother without realizing that it was his father or his mother. But still, I mean, murdering somebody, you know, or deleting them, I guess you got to be careful about your words, your language on YouTube. But I mean, even that, I mean, there's going to be some motivation for it, and you're not going to have like this totally calm, enlightened motivation for committing a horrific crime. A horrific crime generally has horrific motivations, horrific mental states going along with it. I mean, you can to some degree. Like, for example, you're some Zen master who is also like a samurai sword master in feudal Japan, who, you know, I mean, they try to be as mindful as they can and have no feelings of hatred or ill will. They're just doing their duty. Just this honor and duty is motivating them. Still, I mean, they're not going to have the mind of a fully enlightened being, you know, likelihood. And so, I mean, they're not going to be committing, or they're not going to be getting as much bad karma. You know, the samurai Zen master, who's also a sword master, you know, he's fighting in a war or fighting duels or fighting just for the sake of duty and honor in some capacity, then he's probably not going to be creating as bad of karma as just some psycho who just like really gets off on like deleting people or whatever. You know, he's not screaming Allahu Akbar thinking he's going to go to heaven. He doesn't even have that as a motivation. It's just duty and honor. You know, it's just what you do because he is in this predicament. It's sort of like the Bhagavad Gita's idea of, you know, you just do what is your ashrama dhamma. You do your duty, your dharma, and, you know, just offer up the results to God. But I mean, even somebody like that, it's hardly likely that they're going to be going around committing horrific crimes. And even if you got somebody like Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita, or the Zen master who is also a sword master in medieval Japan, that, I mean, they're still going to be making some karma so long as they're not fully enlightened. And if they are fully enlightened, then, I mean, the texts indicate that they're not going to be committing horrific crimes. They just are not going to have the motivation for that. They're not going to have any will to do that. So if you've got the will to commit a horrific crime, that's already bad karma. So let's see here. What is exactly the question here? Someone theoretically committed a horrific crime but maintained perfect mental equanimity while doing it. Would they be free of all karmic consequences? Theoretically, if it was possible to commit a horrific crime with an enlightened, completely unattached mind and no volition at all, because a fully enlightened being, because he's not creating karma, he really doesn't have what could be called volition or cetana in the ordinary sense of the term. You know, it's like going with St. John of the Cross's interpretation of such a person. They're not acting on their own self-will anymore. They're just acting through the will of God. Of course, Buddhists have a different way of interpreting it, which can get kind of abstruse. If you read Abhidhamma texts, you know, they have to invent an entirely new kind of mental state or consciousness or something called, what is it? Kriya Chitta, or just functional consciousness. That's how an arahant can still seem to act volitionally while generating no actual cetana or volition, because volition is karma. So, I mean, Jimmy Lad here would have to figure out how a person with no volition would want to commit a horrific crime. How are you possibly going to delete your own mother, for example, without having really horrible mental states? Because, we're just human. You just have like built in certain, I don't know what you call it, like taboos, or just you have built in certain like don't do this kind of stuff. And like if you're committing a horrific crime, as a general rule, you are transgressing your own like instinctive programming to some degree. So, technically, in a purely theoretical sense, like if a fully enlightened being with no ill will, nothing like that, committed a horrific crime, he would create no karma. But why would he do it? If he has no ill will, why would he be committing horrific crimes? If he has no greed or hate or delusion, what would cause him to do it? But you could have like a very wise person, or even a fully enlightened person who may do something that seems blameworthy, but let's say they're not fully enlightened, they're just wise, like the Zen master who's also a sword master. They're not going to create as bad of karma as just the person who's just psycho and going berserk. But still, yeah, I think I've answered this question like 2 or 3 times already, just in the past few to several minutes. I'm just kind of like answering in circles at this point. But yeah, if you have no horrific motivations, you're extremely unlikely to commit a horrific crime. The actions are just the outward manifestations of your own mental states that are in there. So, theoretically, maybe somehow, but it just goes against human nature. And really, Dhamma and Buddhist ethics really are attuned to human nature to a profound degree, more so than other spiritual systems that I won't bother to mention. And so I'm just going to move on to Jimmy Lad's next question. And the heading for this one, the title, if you will, is Meditation and Dissociation. Or he has disassociation, which may be kind of a British thing. So the question is, when I meditate, sometimes I unintentionally cultivate disassociation and alienation. It feels like I am descending into the indistinction of prime matter rather than ascending and expanding my mind. I seem to just withdraw into myself and shrink into my individuality and small life rather than anything profound. Any advice? Well, I'm not exactly sure what kind of meditation Jimmy Lad is practicing, but if you're practicing just standard Buddhist satipatthana, like mindfulness meditation, what some people call vipassana, then, whatever arises, you just note it and let it go. And this is what St. John of the Cross was telling his disciples, or, the people that he was, the father confessor and like the spiritual guide of. It's like, whatever it is that arises, just let it go. So, when you're meditating, all kinds of stuff can happen. Your mind can rebel. Your mind can just go into perverse directions. It can just do all kinds of stuff. But so long as you're practicing like mindfulness meditation and you're just noting it, letting it go, noting it and letting it go. The urge to commit horrific crimes arises, note it, let it go. Just feeling like, alienated. What does that feel like? Note it, let it go. Just observe it, let it go. And then if you get really good, then the observation just becomes passive. It's more seeing than looking. That's sort of like an advanced stage of meditation, when you're not seeing and when you're not looking and listening or believing anymore. You're just like seeing and hearing and knowing. But I'm not exactly sure what kind of meditation Jimmy Lad is practicing. Descending, it feels like he is descending into the indistinction of prime matter. I'm not exactly sure what that would feel like. rather than ascending and expanding my mind. Well, I mean, you shouldn't really have this preconceived goal. Goal-oriented Dhamma is danger. Beware of goal-oriented Dhamma. My old website used to say that, but the old website is now defunct. So, I mean, you just, like, if you're doing mindfulness meditation, just whatever arises, you note it and let it go. And then it can just be the whole gamut or the whole spectrum of possible stuff can arise. It doesn't matter. You just note it, let it go, note it, let it go, note it, let it go. But I mean, if you're practicing some method other than just mindfulness, and that's leading you in a direction that you feel like the wrong direction, then maybe you should try a different meditation method. Let's see. Feels like he is descending into the indistinction of prime matter. Yeah, I'm not exactly sure what that would feel like. But you shouldn't necessarily be trying to ascend and expand your mind. I mean, if you meditate correctly, you still may not ascend, but at least your mind will expand, like your consciousness will expand. It will become clearer, quieter, that kind of thing. But, I mean, you shouldn't be trying to make it happen. You just follow, like, a good meditation technique, and if you meditate correctly, then it'll happen of its own accord. So I guess I answered that question. I'm going to move on to the next question, which is from Throat Warbler Mangrove. And he says, to be or not to be? And really, that is the question. At least if you're Shakespeare, Hamlet. To be or not to be? Well, I mean, from the point of view of Buddhist philosophy, like if you read the Kalaha Vivada Sutta, which is in the Atthakawagga of the Sutta Nipata, very old sutta, it indicates that to be and not to be are just a kind of mind-generated dichotomy. You know, it's mind-made. Existence and non-existence. It's this duality. So long as you're thinking of existence or non-existence, you're still stuck in this like mind-generated samsaric duality. Whereas ultimate reality transcends the duality of existence and non-existence, which to a samsaric mind makes no sense whatsoever. But samsaric mind is a deluded mind. It kind of reminds me of Hegel, how he started his dialectic and his logic, how pure being and pure non-being really just disappear into each other. There's no like discernible distinction between the two. So, after he gets into that beginning of his dialectic, he just takes it as a given that pure being and pure non-being are synonymous. So, yeah, I mean, if it's either way, if it's existence or non-existence, still, I mean, non-existence, I mean, that's just, it's kind of tricky, non-existence, because, I mean, when you're talking about it, it's an it. It's non-existence in quotes, which is still exists. You know, it's still something. But you get rid of even the not to be, then, I mean, you get rid of this, the concept, the idea of non-existence. Then, I mean, you're off the scale at that point. Same as, I mean, it's existence and non-existence is like this fake duality. And it may not make sense if to an intellectual mind, either something has to be A or not A. That's one of the Aristotelian laws of thought. Everything has to be A or not A. But, I mean, it's fairly easy to point out even samsaric, like, things that can break that rule. And when you get into ultimate reality, then there is no existence or non-existence. Which is hard to explain. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Thought Fog. And Thought Fog says, have you met Ajahn Sona? I ask because a few of the same people who ask questions here on this podcast also ask on his streams every Sunday. And no, I have not met Ajahn Sona. Before I came back to America in 2011, I did write a letter to his monastery, I think it's Birken Forest Monastery in British Columbia, in Canada. And I was told that only people ordained in the Ajahn Chah tradition can stay there. And that was pretty much it. I've seen a few of his videos, and my friend Brian has a high opinion of Ajahn Sona. But I haven't met him in person, and I'm not even sure that he even read anything that I wrote to him or to his monastery, because it may have just been some monastery attendant or some other monk who got the letter and answered it. I don't recall now, if I ever knew. So, yeah, I think Ajahn Sona is one of the better monks in the West that I know of, but I've never met him. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. And the next question is, my next question is about Nāgārjuna. Would you please just tell me all about them? And so he seems to have this idea that there was more than one Nāgārjuna, which apparently there was. And I'm asked about Nāgārjuna. I don't have the fez. Just a second. Not totally prepared today, because I already started this without a beverage. Let's see. See, the thing with Nāgārjuna, though, is I really don't know a whole heck of a lot about him. I've read his Mula Majjhimaka Karaka in English translation. I've read, there's a book, K. Venkata Ramanan, called Nāgārjuna's Philosophy. I think you have it on the bookcase back there. Excellent book. It's very profound, but it's sort of a misleading title, because it's like a translation, English translation of a commentary of, I think it's the Mula Majjhimaka Shastra or something, that traditionally is attributed to Nāgārjuna, but nowadays scholars think that the famous Nāgārjuna didn't write it. It's sort of like apocrypha, but it may be that Nāgārjuna did have a disciple who was also named Nāgārjuna, who may have written this text. But I mean, it is worth reading if you like reading like really heavy, deep philosophy, like especially Indian Mahayana Buddhist philosophy. Then yeah, Nāgārjuna's Philosophy by K. Venkata Ramanan is well worth reading. And I encountered that at Pandita Rama in Rangoon, Burma, when I went to a intensive meditation retreat there, like around 1997. And it was on the bookshelf, and I wanted to read it, but I was there to meditate. And so I just got my hands on the book probably a few years later and read it in a cave in Burma somewhere. But Nāgārjuna himself, I mean, the amount of information about him is limited, and a lot of it is kind of legend. For example, some scholars argue that there's no real proof that he was a Mahayana Buddhist, especially because the main work attributed to him, like his magnum opus, so to speak, the Mula Majjhimaka Karaka, doesn't mention Mahayana Buddhism at all. And so these scholars assume that he was a Hinayana Buddhist, so to speak, Shravakayana, if you want to be more polite, who nevertheless was like a founding father, of Mahayana Buddhism. Although others will say that some of his letters are very Mahayanistic, very devotionalistic, that they consider the letters to be legitimate. And so in that case, he probably was an early Mahayana Buddhist, but he wrote the Mula Majjhimaka Karaka just to be sort of get the message to all Buddhists. So he just deliberately left out this newfangled Mahayana stuff in order to try to persuade, some of the earlier schools of Buddhism, at least certain members of the earlier schools of Buddhism, that what he had to say was worth consideration. And I do think that he understood dependent co-arising or paticca-samuppada better than, for example, the orthodox position in Theravada Buddhism understands it. going with the first group of philosophers who think that he wasn't a Mahayana Buddhist yet. He was sort of proto-Mahayana. That he was kind of putting his message out there, and it wasn't the older schools of Buddhism who had already kind of settled on their doctrine, but it was the new Mahayana Buddhists who were kind of looking for good arguments to support their cause. And his philosophy pretty well accounts for like prajna paramita, those strange suttas, the paradoxical ones that were coming out early on in the history of Mahayana Buddhism. So they kind of drafted him as one of the patriarchs. I mean, he is one of the patriarchs of Mahayana Buddhism, or at least of Zen Buddhism. He's considered an early Indian patriarch. Mahakassapa was the first patriarch after the Buddha himself, and I don't know what number that Nāgārjuna would be, but he's on the list of the Indian patriarchs. When you read old Zen texts, like Chinese Zen texts, talking about the Indian patriarchs and the Chinese patriarchs, and well, Nāgārjuna is considered, even if he wasn't really a Mahayana Buddhist, to be a Mahayana patriarch. Mahakassapa almost certainly could not be called a Mahayana Buddhist, but he's considered to be the first patriarch. Nāgārjuna, apparently, according to the legends, he was like a Brahmin who lived in like South India or South Central India, but he was a teacher at Nalanda University. So I guess he traveled north to teach and then come back down south to just do his meditation and that sort of thing. One of the letters that he wrote is to a South Indian king, just sort of giving him guidance on how to be a good king, I guess. But really, aside from that, I really don't know much biographical detail about Venerable Nāgārjuna, but I do think that he was one of the greatest philosophers of the history of philosophy. In a way, he was able to, in an elegant intellectual manner, explain some of Buddhist philosophy that the earlier schools, then like formal logic wasn't advanced enough back then, or for whatever reason, they just really did not do as good of a job as Nāgārjuna did of describing like voidness and like no self, this kind of thing, or dependent co-arising, especially how everything is conditioned, how we're living in a kind of virtual reality. Nāgārjuna was able to explain that well, kind of, but at the same time, everything just kind of devolves into voidness. Majjhimaka, it's like the Mula Majjhimaka Karaka, it's the structure of it is largely based, the structure of much of it is based on asking a question and then having the answer be yes, no, yes and no, or neither yes nor no. And he just rules out all possibilities for one question after another after another. I think the first question is an effect the same as the cause? And he just uses these logical arguments. At least they seemed logical to ancient Indians, to rule out, yes, it's the same as the cause. No, it's not the same as the cause. No, it's it's the same and different from the cause, and it's neither the same nor different from the cause. He just rules out all of that, moves on to the next question, rules out all possible answers for that, moves on to the next question, rules out all possible answers for that, so that in a way, it's like this intellectually elegant way of just shooting down all intellectuality. And in a way, it's sort of like the snake swallowing its own tail, where at the end, it even just sort of destroys itself, and then it just leaves like silence behind, because you can't describe the highest truth in words. The name that can be named is not the eternal name. So I guess that'd be a fairly good place to stop answering that question. And since the next question is not about Nāgārjuna, I take off the Majjhimaka fez. And so, Thought Fog's next question here is, I would say that, you could probably learn more about Nāgārjuna, like his biography or something, just look him up on the Wikipedia, look him up on the internet, and I'm sure you'd find more information about him than I just shared with you, because my knowledge of the man is rather limited. I mean, I'm not really so much interested in the biographies as just what did the person have to say. So anyways, I'm moving on to Thought Fog's next question, which is, out of the old Buddhist bodhisattvas, like whom to you has a particularly touching and or profound story? Well, bodhisattvas is Mahayana Buddhism. And my reading about Mahayana bodhisattvas is very limited. I really consider it to be like mythology. You know, it's interesting maybe from an anthropological point of view, understanding the history of Buddhism, that kind of thing. But for the most part, I consider like Kuan Yin. I mean, Kuan Yin was based on the Indian bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, I'm pretty sure. And then he kind of transitioned into female at some point. And I mean, it's Hercules got conflated with, what was it, Vajrapani, a bodhisattva called Vajrapani, that in the Gandharan sculptures of mainly what is now Afghanistan or like northern Pakistan, that there are actual like statues and like bas reliefs carved into walls, or the side of mountains or whatever, of Hercules guarding the Buddha. And I mean, Hercules is there because he's been conflated with, I think it's Vajrapani or Padmapani. It's one of these early Indian bodhisattvas. But I mean, from the Theravada point of view, there's one main bodhisattva, and that's just the Buddha before his enlightenment. Or you could stretch that back into his previous lives, some of which are described in the Jataka stories, which again are just mythology, talking animals and so forth. So my favorite bodhisattva would have to be Gautama Buddha before his enlightenment. And that's the only bodhisattva that really has any kind of historical backing, unless they've taken some other historical characters and converted them into bodhisattvas. And I really wouldn't know who that would be. Hercules, but I mean, Heracles, I mean, probably there was a person upon which the legends of Heracles were based, or at least the earliest legends of Heracles. He was some Dorian warlord who participated in, taking over large parts of Greece during the Dark Ages. Part of the Dorian invasion, or at least he was a Dorian who was already passed away, but venerated by the Dorians, who were like expanding in their control of ancient Greece, that kind of thing. So maybe Heracles or Padmapani or Vajrapani, whichever Pani he was. But I mean, aside from that, I mean, it's just, if you read about the Bodhisattva or the Bodhisattva of Mangala Buddha in the Buddha Wangsa, I mean, it's like a Monty Python. It's so bizarre. I've talked about him before. Yeah, I mean, see, let me just read the question one last time here. Out of the old Buddhist bodhisattvas, like whom to you has a particularly touching and or profound story? Well, Gautama Buddha would have to be the only one that really, I mean, I pay any real heed to or take seriously. And even that is largely legend, with mythology creeping in. But I'm really not a Mahayana Buddhist. I mean, some aspects of Mahayana Buddhism, I think in some respects the Mahayana Buddhists describe things better than like the Theravada Buddhists, like emptiness, for example. Nāgārjuna and his accounting for dependent core rising, for example. So, I mean, there is a lot of wisdom in Mahayana texts, but when you start getting into the Bodhisattva stuff and the mythological space Buddhas and all that, and I just lose interest. I just can't take it very seriously. I mean, does it help just learning stories about bodhisattvas that in all likelihood didn't really exist, at least not in an empirical, objective sense. I mean, does it help you to become enlightened or not? Manjushri, God of wisdom. I mean, I guess he's supposed to be a bodhisattva also. So, I mean, he's kind of interesting. He's got a sword. But, you know, it's just mythology as far as I can tell. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Kundru. And Kundru says, how do you interpret magical or supernatural elements in the suttas? For example, do you accept occurrences like the Buddha taking 7 steps after his birth as something that really happened? Do you just disregard things like this entirely, or is there some sort of middle ground? Well, I guess most of the miracle stories you find in the texts, and the talking animals and so forth, most of that I would consider to be mythology. You know, you have a pre-modern mindset that really accepts the possibility of this stuff and just is credulous with regard to a lot of things. They hear a story about the Buddha performing a miracle, and they just accept it as truth, and it finds its way into the scriptures. But some of the stuff, like, you know, like the Buddha knowing somebody else's mind, that some of that stuff, maybe a few of the psychic feats that are described in the text, I'm not just saying it's impossible, but I would guess that most of like the psychic powers exercised by wise monks of the past, including the Buddha himself, that most of it just didn't really find its way into the text because it wasn't something really dramatic. You know, just knowing somebody else's mind, or knowing, you know, just seeing their past lives, commenting on that. You know, that happens sometimes. Maharaji Neem Crowley Baba up there, right there. I mean, he would just look into you and just see. I mean, in a way, he'd know you better than you know yourself. You know, he'd see your past lives and all this, supposedly, according to, you know, people that knew him. At least he'd be commenting on their past lives. So, I mean, stuff like that can happen. I mean, I don't think that there were very many duels going on with fire-breathing cobra dragons. I don't think there are very many animals like, say, quails or monkeys that were speaking fluent Pali with human intelligence. It could be that some devas did come to visit, you know, some non-human beings would come to visit the Buddha or other monks. I mean, the biography or autobiography of Ajahn Mun has lots and lots of that. So, I mean, some of this stuff, I mean, it can have an element of truth to it, but I do not think that the Pali texts really can be relied upon to be just like accurate, objective representations of empirical facts, because there's so many examples of things that I just can't believe. The twin miracle where the Buddha levitated up into the air, spraying fire out of one side of himself, out of his body, and water out of the other at the same time, and then switching up so that the side that was shooting fire is now shooting water, and vice versa. All this to impress some Brahmins, that kind of thing. On the other hand, let's say the story of the Buddha like in his final days, where he's about ready to die, and he and Ananda are walking along, and he says to Ananda to get some water out of a stream, and a bunch of, like a caravan of wagons have just gone through that stream. The water's all muddy. Ananda says, the water's all muddy. It's, you know, it's not drinkable. The Buddha just says, go ahead and get some. And then it's like miraculously the water is clear when Ananda scoops it up. That something like that, I mean, it's possible. I'm not going to just say nope. None of it could possibly happen. You know, I'm not a materialist. I do think that miracles do happen, or at least violations of what scientists call the laws of physics, that can happen, and that it's more likely to happen around very advanced, like sages and saints. Levitation, for example. So, yeah, I do have an open mind toward the possibility of these things, while at the same time thinking, in all probability, most of the accounts that you see in texts, Pali texts, Mahayana texts, whatever, are likely to be legends and mythology that really are not empirical facts. It's just what people believed at the time. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from Still Not Sure. And this is kind of a simple question. He says, would you please read Industrial Society and Its Future by Theodore Kaczynski? And I mean, I could, but I don't read very much. And it certainly would not be near the top of the list of books that I would read, especially considering that I've had people send me books that have been written by themselves or by like their brother, this kind of thing, that would have to be higher up on the list than reading Ted Kaczynski's manifesto. I mean, I might read it someday. I'm going to have to kind of change my habits because I really have just kind of pretty much stopped reading books. But I am sort of obligated to read some of the books that people have sent to me. And in one case, I promised that either my woman or I would read it, and I don't think she's going to read it. So the duty falls upon me to read that one. And maybe while I'm not working 40 hours a week, or 55 hours a week, I should say, and looking for a more suitable way of earning a living, that maybe I will sit down and read a book, which would be good for me, I think. I used to read all the time. And then after coming back to America, and especially after I stopped being a monk, I just acquired new habits, I guess. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Warm Shadow. And Warm Shadow says, can ordained monks maintain a fitness routine based around calisthenics and plyometrics, isometrics, and cardio without incurring unskillful karma? And then he continues, what I mean to say is, if I ordain as a monk, will I be reprimanded by the senior monk for doing pull-ups? Well, I mean, what is the purpose of this? I mean, for a monk, you shouldn't be trying to beautify yourself. And really, you just need to be healthy enough to practice Dhamma. So, I mean, when I was ordained temporarily as a novice, a year or two before I was fully ordained as a monk, just sort of like a dress rehearsal, I went to the monastery and was ordained as a temporary samanera or novice for 5 weeks. And at the time, I was doing regular like sit-ups and push-ups and so forth every night. And one time I was doing my exercises, and one of the senior monks came in. And he just said, "Don't bother with that. Don't do that." So, I mean, it would depend on what the attitude is of the senior monks at your monastery, especially your preceptor. If you're ordained as a monk and your preceptor says, you don't need to bother with this stuff. You don't need to be sculpted. You don't need to be buff. You should be skinny. You should be healthy enough that you're able to practice Dhamma for the sake of your enlightenment. But how does, being able to do 200 push-ups help you to become enlightened? So it may be that you would have some hard-nosed senior monk say, don't bother with that. And then if you continue to do it, then you might be reprimanded because you were told once and you just continue doing it. On the other hand, you might go to some other monastery where the abbot is doing exercises, or it's just he doesn't care if you do exercises. But I mean, from like the traditional, like orthodox Theravada point of view, yeah, I mean that would be excessive to maintain a fitness routine based around calisthenics, plyometrics, isometrics, and cardio. That, what is the purpose of that? Why would a monk do that? I mean, it's not just to be healthy. You can be healthy just, chop wood, carry water, and do a lot of walking. I mean, that's really how I stayed relatively healthy as a monk. Chop wood, carry water, carrying a 5-gallon bucket up a hill. It takes at some exercise. Even swimming, I mean, for the sake of your health, I mean, that's kind of borderline. But doing a lot of walking is fine. Volunteering to help around the monastery, doing fetching and toting and such, that's fine. But I mean, how would you justify, as a monk who supposedly is dedicating his life to enlightenment in this very life, I mean, what would be the point of maintaining a fitness routine based around calisthenics, plyometrics, isometrics, and cardio? I think that would be kind of worldly, excessive in a worldly sense. Unless you have some health problem where your health is just going to degenerate unless you're really, really working out a lot. But again, it's going to be up to the senior monks at your monastery whether or not they're going to tell you to stop doing that. I mean, and probably they're not going to reprimand you the first time, but if you keep doing it after they tell you you don't need to do that anymore, then you might get reprimanded or scolded or something. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Arpad. And Arpad says, when you lived in isolated places, how would you treat wounds when or if you got injured? Well, when you live in tropical Asia, like remote areas of Burma, you have to have a fairly well-stocked first aid kit. So, yeah, I had a pretty good first aid kit. I mean, you have to have malaria medicine. You have to have some kind of diarrhea medicine, obviously. Dewormer. It's good to have what's it called? The stuff that you use for amoebic dysentery and giardiasis. Metronidazole, I think it's called. I usually have 2 different kinds of antibiotics. Tetracycline, which is good for skin infections or blood poisoning, or also, I mean, it can be used as a prophylaxis against malaria, but I didn't use it for that. And then a broader spectrum that's better for respiratory tract infections, that kind of thing, like amoxicillin or ciprofloxacin or something like that. So, I mean, you'd have antibiotic cream or ointment, So, I mean, fortunately, I didn't injure myself badly enough. I didn't break any bones, that kind of thing. I mean, if you break a tooth, then you got to go into town and find a dentist. Or if you get really sick from malaria or something, then you may have to go into town and find a doctor. But I was never really injured badly enough that I couldn't just deal with it myself. I had stubbed toes from walking around rocky areas with no shoes on, or I mean, some things, it happens, you just don't really need. You get stung by a scorpion, there's not a whole hell of a lot you can do. Fortunately, I wasn't bitten by any venomous snakes, so you can't really carry around anti-venom. So yeah, I mean, I had a first aid kit, and then if something happened that I wasn't able to deal with, then some village doctor or some doctor from town would come and help me out. Because I would, if you're the exotic foreigner living in tropical Asia, there's a good chance that at least one doctor is going to volunteer his services in case you ever need it. There was one doctor who volunteered his services. There's no way I'd let him come around me with a scalpel. Man, he was kind of a quack doctor, in my opinion. It was if I got sick, he'd give me 7 or 8 different kinds of medicine, just in case one of them didn't work, the other one would, that kind of thing. One time, I stepped on some kind of, I can't remember what it was, stepped on some kind of big acacia spine or something, and he just sent me a tetanus vaccine and a hypodermic syringe. And you look on the label of the tetanus vaccine, and it says keep refrigerated in big block letters. And he sent it to me in the hot season. The stuff is 100 degrees Fahrenheit when he sends it to me. So, yeah, I was just, the thing is, I mean, if you're a monk and you protect Dhamma, Dhamma protects you, and you're not going to get more than you can handle. That's something you can have faith in, I suppose. At least accept it as a working hypothesis. So, I did find that some of the herbal stuff works better than some of the medicines, like the anti-diarrhea stuff. There was like the bark of a certain tree that villagers would grind and prepare for me and give me that, and it worked better than like the pills that, like the pharmaceutical stuff that would be given to you by a doctor. But I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Liberating Insights. And Liberating Insights says, will consciousness cease or remain in Nibbāna? And this is kind of a trick question. Because, I mean, consciousness as vijnana khanda, which is sort of like the background of your mental states, technically that ceases when you become, especially when you attain parinibbana. You're an enlightened being, and then you leave your body, so to speak. You cease metabolizing. Your body ceases to metabolize. Then when all the 5 khandhas stop. But I mean, I've talked about this many times. It's kind of a pet theme of mine that there are at least 2 suttas, one in the Digha Nikaya, one in the Majjhima Nikaya, that imply that infinite formless consciousness is the same as Nibbāna or Nirvana. And so in that case, you would say, when you attain Nibbāna, you don't become unconscious. Consciousness doesn't cease. It becomes infinite and formless and unmanifest. Like the Gautika Sutta of the Samyutta Nikaya, one of my favorite suttas. It's a weird one, where Gautika essentially self-deletes and becomes enlightened at the moment of his death. And so the Buddha, just using like clairvoyant powers, maybe this really happened. Maybe this would be a case of the Buddha really using a psychic power that is recorded in the text and really happened. Maybe. But anyways, the Buddha knows that Venerable Gautika has died. And so he says, well, Venerable Gautika has died. We got to go and give him a cremation. We got to go, deal with the body. So the Buddha and his sangha of monks that were accompanying him go to the Black Rock at Isigili Cave. There's Gautika lying dead on his little bed. And the Buddha points out to the monks, you see that mist that's moving, in all these different directions? It's moving all over the place. There's like this little cloud. And the monks say, yes, Venerable Sir, we can see that. And he says, that's Mara, the evil one, who is searching for the consciousness of Venerable Gautika, but he's not going to find it because the consciousness of Gautika has become unmanifest. Which means it's just sort of like the boundaries have just dissolved, disappeared. And so you wind up with something that's infinite and formless, unmanifest. But the thing is, anything that's infinite, formless, and unmanifest, you can't really say that if it exists or doesn't exist. It's getting back to Hegel and his thesis and antithesis, pure being, pure non-being, the same. So when something becomes formless and unmanifest, I mean, from a samsaric point of view, from an empirical point of view, I mean, it's off the scale. You can't really say that it exists or doesn't exist. I mean, you could say either one or both or neither, and none of it would be ultimately really valid. So some people would say Nibbāna is infinite formless consciousness. Others might say that you become more and more conscious until you hit this stage where it just goes off the scale and you can't say anything about it. But Nibbāna isn't just non-existence, like a lot of Western Buddhists would prefer to believe. So, I think I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from PSA. And PSA says, what's your opinion of the USA going to Venezuela and removing Maduro? Venezuelans are celebrating while liberals are outraged. They don't care about the opinion of the Venezuelan people, who are actually the ones most affected by this situation. Liberals just want to carry out their virtue signaling tactics to gain power. Yeah, the last update on the whole Maduro drama is that the Venezuelan government is releasing its political prisoners, or at least lots of them, which is causing further rejoicing in Venezuela, I think, because they probably had quite a few political prisoners locked up in prisons around Caracas especially. But the thing about the USA going to Venezuela and removing Maduro, this whole situation has so many tentacles that a guy just reading up on it, sitting at a computer, and it's hardly likely he's going to get anywhere near to a comprehensive understanding of what the hell is going on. So, I mean, with regard to PSA talking about liberals or outrage, I mean, it's not really liberals. I mean, liberal has just become synonymous with leftist, I think, in the West, or a leftist who falls short of being just a full-blown communist. But I mean, I consider myself to be a classical liberal, like a John Stuart Mill type liberal. It's just that classical liberals used to be Democrats. Now they're Republicans because the Democratic Party has moved so far to the left that a classical liberal with like a free thinker who believes in individual rights and freedoms and so forth, they're now considered to be magatards. And it is true that the leftists, I mean, they just hysterically oppose anything Trump is in favor of, which includes like law enforcement, enforcing the laws. I mean, if there's any leftists out there watching this, the thing to do, if you don't like a law, saying, for example, people who are in this country without a valid passport or visa should be ejected from the country, if you don't like that law, you don't just try to get in the way of the police officers trying to enforce the law. What you do, you go to your politicians, your representatives in Congress, for example, and have them change the law. You don't just reject or deny like laws that the government is legally obligated to enforce. Well, I mean, the left, I mean, they're on the side of Somali scammers and they're on the side of just criminals in general. Like George Floyd he's like a saint now, or at least he was. Now I guess the lesbian poet who was shot by an ICE officer, that she's going to be like the new Saint George Floyd. Regardless of the facts of the case, leftists look at the very same video footage. If they go on to X or something, the network news isn't going to show it to you, but they'll look at the unedited video footage and still they'll say, oh, this Gestapo agent just murdered some innocent US citizen for no reason. And then the other extreme is you've got like the real hard-nosed conservatives calling her a domestic terrorist out to kill people and so forth. But really, there is kind of a middle path there. But getting back to the actual question, what's your opinion of the USA going to Venezuela and removing Maduro? I mean, I don't know. I don't know enough about it. I'm sure that Donald Trump and Marco Rubio and the other people that were like behind this, they know a hell of a lot more about it than I do. And so I just kind of have a certain amount of faith that they pretty much know what they're doing. I mean, I'm not going to take the leftist point. It's like the leftists have like the opposite point of view. So anything Trump does is bad and wrong. Just anything. It's like become a meme now where, Trump is, for my next trick, I will get the Democrats to support, criminal child molesters or whatever it is. Because anything that he's against, they're for, and vice versa. But with regard to Maduro, I mean, the Biden administration put like a $25 million bounty on him. I mean, the leftists wanted Maduro deposed before Trump took office, but now that Trump took office and actually did it, then they're saying, no, he's a dictator who's declaring war without congressional approval and all this. But I mean, how good or bad of an idea it was to go in there and capture Maduro, I really can't say because I don't know enough about it. I assume that there's a whole bunch of different factors, including just Maduro taunting Trump, saying, come and get me. And just, like, I don't know, he's just taunting Trump. So Trump's like, all right, All right, bluff is called, buddy boy, or also just like preventing China from getting Venezuelan oil. I mean, that's to the advantage of America, I assume. Just showing the world. It's like we're not Biden's America anymore. We're not perpetrating the fiasco of the withdrawal from Afghanistan at this point. We bypassed all the Russian and Chinese anti-aircraft stuff, partly through like bribing people on the inside in Venezuela, I assume. But still, it's like they performed a military act, a military operation that possibly nobody else could have done. And Trump is just showing, you guys pay heed to what we just did because we can do it to you. So, I mean, that is probably in America's interests, at least if you're like an America first kind of person. You're a patriotic America who thinks America should be strong and prosperous and not just, voluntarily immolate itself and manage decline. Go back to a vigorous patriarchy. Then, yeah, I assume that what Trump directed or allowed by capturing Maduro, I assume that it's more good than bad from an American point of view. But I mean, there's so many tentacles to this thing that it's impossible really to know for sure exactly what the hell's going on. And anyways, Maduro being captured is now eclipsed by the lesbian poetess being shot by an ICE agent in Minneapolis. So that's last week's news. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Cherzaskaziz. And Cherzaskaziz says, since the teachings of the early Buddhist schools did not differ in terms of the suttas, but only in terms of the Abhidhamma, then did the early Buddhist schools differ significantly in Vinaya? And the scholars say that the early Buddhist schools differed in Vinaya less than they differed in the suttas. It was more of a philosophical difference than a monastic discipline difference. You read the Patimokkha rules of various ancient sects, including Theravada and Sarvastivada and Mahasanghika and Dharmottara and all this. The core rules of the Patimokkha are essentially the same, very few differences. Maybe a slight difference in interpretation. The Sekya rules that were added later have much more differences. But as a general rule, the rules of monastic discipline are very similar, more similar than the suttas. So the rules of monastic discipline are like at least 90% the same throughout the early Indian schools before you get the advent of Mahayana. The suttas maybe 80 or 85% the same. They're relatively similar. And of course, the Abhidhammas or Abhidharmas are just all over the place. Like Theravada and Sarvastivada were closely related. They were essentially the same school up until the Third Council, like during the reign of the Emperor Ashoka, which was when one of the main purposes of the Third Council, I'm pretty sure, is essentially to purge the Sarvastivadin heretics out of the Theravadin Sangha. It's like, are we going to go in a Theravada direction or a Sarvastivada direction in our interpretation of Dhamma? And I guess there was like a power struggle or whatever, and a certain Mogali Puddhatissa came out on top, and they drove out the Sarvastivadins who went off into northwestern India and converted the Kushans. So yeah, the Abhidhammas, I mean, I was going to say that even though Theravada and Sarvastivada were like very closely related, they split apart at the Third Council or thereabouts, still their Abhidhammas are completely different. Not a single book of their Abhidhammas are the same. So you go from like 90% the same in Vinaya, maybe 85% the same in the suttas, with some of that just being different ways of editing the same material. And then you get down to like 5% the same in the Abhidhammas. Not one book the same. So, yeah, there's more of a difference in philosophy, which would include the suttas, than there was in just monastic practice, which was more conservative. that, I mean, monks might not follow all the rules correctly, but they're less likely to cook up new rules, except for there was one, I think it was the Mula Sarvastivadins, who they added a lot of like devotional material and so forth to their Vinaya Pitaka. And also they had rules where monks were allowed to wear boots, and monks had a certain, it was like a staff that they would take with them when they'd walk into the village, like when they go for alms, and it had like these metal rings that would jingle when they'd hit the staff on the ground. And that was because they prospered in like the foothills of the Himalayas, where it got cold in the cold season, and the villages would have their doors closed to keep in the warmth. And so you had to have a monk make a noise, like jingling the metal rings on this staff to let people know that there were monks out there. And of course they're wearing boots to protect their feet from the ice and so forth. So, I mean, there were some changes in Vinaya, but for the most part, Vinaya was the most conservative aspect of like Dhamma, Theravada Buddha, or just early Buddhism. And the suttas, for the most part, they were fairly similar, especially the core texts, which existed before the division into schools. So it was, like Abhidhamma, Abhidharma, and commentarial interpretation of the texts that really started going radically in different directions. And I'm just going to move on to Cherzaskas's next question, which is, if someone today rejects the Abhidhamma of Theravada, can they still call themselves a Theravada Buddhist? And yeah, I think most Western monks reject the Abhidhamma, or just like ignore it. Just they don't want to go there. And they call themselves Theravada Buddhists. I mean, if you're ordained in a Theravada Buddhist tradition, that pretty much makes you officially a Theravada Buddhist. So, I rejected the Abhidhamma of Theravada, and I still considered myself to be a Theravada Buddhist, at least like officially. And with regard to like my Buddhism, my philosophy, that sort of thing, I'm more Theravada than anything else. So, I mean, people nowadays, they ask me if I'm a Theravada Buddhist. I'll say I'm more Theravada Buddhist than anything else. But yeah, I think if someone today rejects the Abhidhamma of Theravada, let's see, they can still call themselves a Theravada Buddhist, because that's essentially what most Western monks are doing. Most Western Theravada Buddhists, although it's kind of a matter of opinion, I guess. Where are you going to draw the line? Like some hard-nosed Burmese Abhidhamma scholar might say, you're just a fake Theravada Buddhist heretic if you reject Abhidhamma, because the Burmese consider Abhidhamma to be the most important, most profound teachings of the Buddha. But then again, you have somebody that goes to Spirit Rock. They call themselves Sangha. They don't keep 5 precepts. They're not ordained, and they reject or ignore most of the Tipitaka. Then, I mean, are they still a Theravada Buddhist? I mean, I remember there was some indignation when I was going through it was like rocky roads with the local Dhamma group, the only Theravada Buddhist group in this town that I was trying to live in as a monk in America. And I'm just kind of pointing out, I mean, it's like, everything is optional to to some of these Western Buddhists. It's like, you don't have to keep sila. I mean, you can just do as you please. And so long as you practice some elementary level meditation and call yourself Sangha, that's good enough. I mean, it's like some of these people, they don't even believe in Nibbāna. Some teachers, they don't believe in Kama. They don't believe in Nibbāna. It's just like Buddhism is just used as a kind of self-help psychological technique. And if you imply that they're not really Theravada Buddhists, they'll get indignant. They'll be offended. So where do you draw the line? It's who you asking. You ask some really strict Burmese Abhidhamma scholar, and he'll say, no, you don't accept Abhidhamma. That's the 3rd Pitaka of the Tipitaka. How are you going to be a Theravada Buddhist if you reject what makes Theravada, which is largely Abhidhamma? So, I mean, if I lived in ancient India and had a choice as to which school of early Buddhism I would follow, I might not choose Theravada if I was able to like look into the different schools. There might be, like the Sautrantikas, they didn't have an Abhidhamma, which would be an improvement over having one, in my opinion. So, yeah, I guess the correct answer to that would be, yeah, of course they can still call themselves a Theravada Buddhist, but some hard-nosed fundamentalist might consider you to be a fake. Micha Theravada. So, but yeah, you can definitely call yourself one. So I'm just going to move on to Cherzaska's third question. What natural disasters occur in Burma? Earthquakes? Yeah, there are earthquakes in Burma. In fact, back in the 70s or 80s, there was a big earthquake in Pagan, which used to be the capital of Burma 1,000 years ago, and the Ananda temple caved in, which is one of the most beautiful temples in Burma, so they had to repair it. And I mean, I lived in caves a lot of the time, so there was a certain amount of concern about earthquakes. When you're living in a cave that can literally cave in, that's why they're called caves, because they can cave in. Aside from that, there are tropical storms. Like back in the 90s, I think there was the tropical storm Nagis that just killed lots of people in Burma. It was really bad, and because the weather patterns are changing a little bit, the path that the tropical storms usually take through Burma are moving more and more towards densely populated areas. So I mean, if not, the tropical storm Nagis went right through the middle of Rangoon, for example, and it was not that far away. In Rangoon, there was lots of trees tipped over, mostly not palm trees. It's weird, the palm trees stayed up and the other trees got broken over, but that would have been really ugly. So there's storms. I mean, you could say droughts would be a natural disaster, in which case you got droughts about maybe 1 out of every 3 years in central Burma. See, what else? Natural disasters. Yeah, I guess that would be about it. That's all I can think of, really. Oh, I did live about 2 miles from a crater lake in the one place I lived in Burma longer than any other place, Wonbo Wildlife Refuge Monastery. It was about two miles away from an extinct volcano, which was a crater lake, and there were huge boulders all over, just strewn over the area that blew out of that volcano. And the volcano was relatively recent, although to a like a geologist, anything that happens within the past 10,000 years is recent. But I mean, theoretically, you could have another volcanic eruption that would completely mess things up. But yeah, I think the main natural disasters in Burma are earthquakes and like tropical storms, like cyclones, that kind of thing. And I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from Siddhartha Lohachita. And Siddhartha Lohachita says, did you meet any of these mad Nazi skinhead gangs in the 80s? And yeah, I do recall occasionally seeing skinheads, the shaved heads and the big boots on. Also punks, and there was a certain overlap between skinheads and punks. So, I mean, you'd see them. I mean, I grew up in Aberdeen, Washington. You might see one walking down the street, or 2 or 3 of them walking down the street. They did live there, but obviously it was very fringe kind of thing. And when I went to college, yeah, there wasn't much of that. I didn't see much of that when I was like in Bellingham, Washington. Bellingham has always leaned far to the left, and even the leftists, they don't accept Nazis, even though Nazis technically were National Socialists. So yeah, I encountered them like from a distance, but that was about as far as it went. And sometimes it's hard to tell the difference between like some neo-Nazi skinhead and just some punk rocker, especially if he doesn't have his hair spiked and like lots of earrings and stuff. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Rui. And Rui said, when you came across the Buddha Dhamma, did it feel like a first encounter or a re-encounter? And it's kind of both, I guess. But I mean, it wasn't so much Buddha Dhamma, it was just Dharma in general. Like, I first got turned on to Eastern philosophy through books of Ram Dass. I was a troubled teenager, went to see a youth counselor at my father's insistence, and it turned out the youth counselor was into Ram Dass, and he gave me 2 books by Ram Dass to read, and also the novel Illusions by Richard Bach, which also was very influential in my thinking as a 17-year-old. The 2 books by Ram Dass were Grist for the Mill and The Only Dance There Is. And so I was this sort of exposed to sort of Indian Dharma in general. And when I'm reading Ram Dass as a 17-year-old, it was just like, in a way, it's hard to explain. It was just like, yeah, it was like intuitively, it was like striking a chord deep down. It was like something that I hadn't been exposed to in this life, although presumably I'd been exposed to it before I was born or something. So that would be like a re-encounter. But when you're a 17-year-old, I mean, it's just, mainly it was just like at some deep intuitive level, it was really striking a chord, even though I didn't fully understand it. It's like when you're reading about like Indian philosophy for the first time, when you've never been exposed to that sort of stuff before, then you can't really remember it very well. You can't integrate it into your memory banks, so to speak, because I mean, you have to make connections, and it was so alien to what I was used to that there was really not much that you could make connections with. And so, I mean, I just didn't fully like absorb it or digest it, but still there's just like this wide-eyed, yeah, this is great. It's like, it just seemed like it was an answer to a question that I've been looking for. As a 17-year-old, it's like my 2 options were just follow the rules, just he who dies with the most toys wins. You just grow up, get married, you go to school, get a job, get married, have kids, and then die of old age. Or you could just party and get in lots of trouble, have lots of fun and lots of the opposite of fun. It's just this chaotic kind of existence. Those were like my 2 main options, and I had experimented with both. And then all of a sudden, here's this other option of Dharma, striving to know ultimate reality, which, according to the text, is possible. So, I mean, that seemed a hell of a lot more meaningful and important than, buying a house in the suburbs or just partying all the time. Just rebelling, conforming and rebelling. That was like the 2 options. And then here's this other option, which in a way, it's just kind of going your own way. It's not really rebelling against anything. It's just sort of not interested. I'm going this way, which is leading towards ultimate reality. So it was a first encounter, and deeper down, I suppose intuitively, it was a re-encounter. So it was both, I guess. And I'm just going to move on to this question. This is from Cleefy. Let's see how long we've been going at this. Hour and a half already. Cleefy says, and Cleefy is in Lithuania, by the way. Cleefy says, reality is not ultimately real. It's created by an unenlightened mind, but we are still experiencing it through birth, sickness, old age, and death. What is this weird place we ended up on that exists and doesn't exist simultaneously? Well, I mean, Cleefy just sort of contradicts himself in the very first part of his sentence here. He says, reality is not ultimately real. So if reality is not ultimately real, it's not really reality, is it? So, I mean, what Cleefy is calling a reality is just like empirical reality, samsaric empirical reality. The stuff that scientists study, I guess. But it would also include like emotions and things that maybe science can't really get very close to yet. Personal experience. So reality is not ultimately real. I mean, that's just self-contradicting right there. It's just kind of a meaningless statement. So what appears to be reality is not ultimately real. What most people consider to be reality is not ultimately real. Okay, it's created by an unenlightened mind, but we are still experiencing it through birth, sickness, old age, and death. What is this weird place we ended up on that exists and doesn't exist simultaneously? Well, it virtually exists. See, the best analogy I can come up with is the block of marble, the uncarved block, what the Tao Te Ching calls the nameless uncarved block. And I mean, I just pound away at this. I talk about it all the time. That you've got this uncarved block, which is like infinite formless consciousness, infinite possibilities. And then some of these possibilities include unenlightened subsets or just limited, just sort of limited aspects of this infinity that are, because they're limited, they just think, they're able to become like recursive, self-referential, and they start thinking that they are separate from everything else, and they're dreaming up this fake reality. I mean, it's like a mirage. You can say, well, I mean, you see the lake with the palm trees in the distance in the classical mirage that, it's not real, but a scientist would say, well, there's obviously something causing that mirage. It's like heat refraction of light, like visual spectrum of electromagnetic radiation, this kind of stuff. There's something there that makes it seem real anyway. So my explanation is that uncarved block of marble contains within it every single possible statue, including some impossible statues. And it's like every single molecule, every single atom of that rock is already right there in the right place for each of those statues. It's really in there. It's just that it takes like imagination or like a deluded mind to separate out these statues and think that they're real. So it's virtually real. It's conditionally real. It's not ultimately real, because ultimate reality is just formless, infinite. Anything that's formless is going to be infinite. It doesn't have any limits, no boundaries. So what is this weird place we ended up on that exists and doesn't exist simultaneously? It's one of the imaginary statues in the uncarved block of marble that's so complicated that it has become self-aware, but in a limited capacity. So it's not aware of the infinity, it's just aware of just this limited aspect of it. And I can explain this a million times, and I think most people still won't get it. And I'm sorry about that, but it's just the way it is. So I'm just going to move on to Cleefe's next question, which is a follow-up from the first one. Is reality a paradox that can't be explained and needs to be accepted as it is? And again, he's using the word reality to mean unreality. So, I mean, that's the first mistake of Cleefe there, is using reality when he means unreality. Or, I mean, at least he should qualify it with like empirical reality or something like personal experience, that kind of thing. But like, is samsaric quasi-reality a paradox that can't be explained and needs to be accepted as it is? Well, I mean, I guess, maybe. I mean, true reality, ultimate reality can't be explained. Because once you start explaining it in words, you're dealing with symbols and perceptions and delusion. So ultimate reality is just off the scale, and no kind of description will apply to it. It's sort of like drawing a picture of God. It's not going to work. But with regard to samsara, is samsara a paradox that can't be explained? And you can explain it. I mean, you can explain fake reality better than you can explain true reality, because fake reality is on the scale. I mean, the whole scale is fake reality. So you can explain that as it's delusion. It's like, starts with the conceit I am. So you've got like this self-recursive consciousness that's just separates itself from the rest of infinity and thinks that this is the truth, and ignores, the infinite amount of other stuff that is also the truth. So true reality may be called a paradox that can't be explained, but fake reality, it's not as much of a paradox, and it kind of can be explained. Although one person's explanation may not really strike any traction at all, because it just may not work. I mean, different explanations, different people may need different kinds of explanations. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Dhamma River. And Dhamma River says, recently I had this conversation about the bodhisattva vow, and they explained something to me that was quite interesting. I told them the bodhisattva vow contradicted the concept of anatta, but they told me that the bodhisattva vow is supposed to awaken your sense of non-duality. I'm paraphrasing what they said, quote, I vow to liberate all beings, and in the process I will understand that not a single being has become liberated. There is no I who liberates and no other who gets liberated. If a bodhisattva holds on to the notion of a self, that person is not a true bodhisattva, unquote. So then Dhamma River continues, I thought that was an amazing explanation. I've never heard a satisfactory Mahayana explanation of the bodhisattva vow before. It agrees with Theravada in my opinion, but I would like to ask your opinion of what they told me, and if you agree or disagree, and also if you think the bodhisattva vow hinders or helps sincere practitioners of the Noble Eightfold Path. So that's kind of a second question. Let's just separate that so I can deal with one at a time. Let's see. All right, I separated it. But I'm still gonna add. Okay. All right, so first question is, he would like to ask my opinion of what they told me, and if you agree or disagree. Well, in a way, it's sort of like cobbling together two aspects of early Mahayana. Mahayana didn't just start off as this unified philosophy. It was like different kind of movements that unified, mainly, I would guess, as a kind of like coalition kind of thing, like a political coalition or something, where you have like the Pure Land Buddhists and the Prajna Paramita Buddhists, and you've got this sort of Mahayana, like the Bodhisattva ideal that is, that might be kind of binding everything together to some degree. And so it's like different ideas that aren't necessarily like compatible get cobbled together into this one system. And so you've got the Bodhisattva who, the whole Bodhisattva is assuming, even the idea of a Bodhisattva is assuming that you have an individual being. A Buddha is an individual being. An unenlightened person, an unenlightened being is an individual being. A Bodhisattva is an individual being. So you're starting off with this assumption that there are individual beings. But then, like early Buddhism, which is also kind of juggling, you've got samsaric conventional truth and you've got this higher truth, and you're trying to just kind of mishmash them together. Like there is no self, but then again, the Buddha existed and his disciples existed and we exist in a samsaric sense. So you're already dealing with troubles just because you're trying to deal with two different levels of reality at the same time. But the whole Bodhisattva vow is, it's based on a glorification of the Buddha. You start off with Gautama Buddha of the Shakya clan, who is telling people how they can become enlightened, and then his later followers glorify him and put him on a pedestal and say that he is just like infinitely beyond an ordinary enlightened being. And then you got, because it glorifies being a Buddha over just being an ordinary enlightened arahant, then you had some religious movements that are saying, well, it's more noble and better to try to be this Sama Sambuddha than to just be some selfish little fully enlightened being that isn't, like helping other beings, like a Pacceka Buddha. They're just like a hermit. They don't even teach anybody. So I think Mahayana, at least the Bodhisattva concept, started with just sort of taking the early Theravada or pre-Mahayana idea of the Bodhisattva, which is just a being that is bound for enlightenment, mainly Gautama of the Shakya clan, and then turning that into like, you should be striving for that instead of just becoming enlightened, which was a misstep in my opinion. Because if you're enlightened, you're enlightened. And the Buddha wasn't, the Buddha himself apparently was teaching people, you should become enlightened. Don't put off being enlightened forever for the sake of becoming a Sama Sambuddha, because probably, they just weren't making this radical distinction between the first enlightened Buddhist and every other enlightened Buddhist after him. Enlightened is enlightened, in my opinion. So, let's see. So in a way, they're just kind of taking this baggage from a different strand of Buddhism and then trying to kind of make it more enlightened, trying to make it make more sense. Instead of dismissing it, they just try to reinterpret it, sort of like Jesus on the cross crying out, my God, why have you abandoned me? It's kind of embarrassing. You have to come up with some plausible explanation for it. And so I think that this person who answered was following a school or a tradition of Mahayana Buddhism that had adopted kind of a sophisticated explanation for a bodhisattva concept that really is not what the Buddha taught. The Buddha would not have endorsed it, in my opinion. And it's kind of based on this devotionalistic, mythological glorification of the founder of the system. But it is true, like in like the Diamond Cutter Sutra, the descriptions of the behavior of a bodhisattva in the Diamond Cutter Sutra are very close to the descriptions of the conduct of an arahant in the older Pali texts. So they're kind of striving toward the same goal of wisdom. It's just they're reinterpreting terms and just sort of adding different concepts that kind of mixes things up, maybe causes a bit of confusion to certain people, and it causes a certain amount of delusion to certain people who just take it literally. So, it does kind of remind me of the platform sutra of Hui Neng, a Chinese Mahayana sutra that has no original Indian version, where Hui Neng says in the sutra that when you become enlightened, you look around, you see that everybody else is enlightened. So, really, the best way to like liberate all beings is to become liberated yourself, and then you just fully, deeply realize that all these beings don't really exist anyway. You see through the illusion. So, yeah, I think the Diamond Cutter Sutra would agree with the idea that if a bodhisattva holds on to the notion of self, that person is not a true bodhisattva. But, why you would have to like throw in all this later Mahayana stuff when the earlier teachings of the historical Buddha really are adequate to account for the situation. It's just followers of tradition that have sort of jumped on the Buddhist train after it has gone a far distance from the original teachings, and still that's the tradition they're exposed to, and so they make the most of it. And it's possible that a Mahayana Buddhist can become enlightened. Possible that a Hindu can become enlightened. Possible that a Christian become enlightened. In some situations, you become enlightened more in spite of the tradition as because of it. But still, some people just have talent, and they're just born in a culture that maybe doesn't have, some kind of like enlightened Buddhism. And so they're just gonna do the best with what they've got, and it may be they have enough talent, they're just ripe enough for enlightenment, like maybe someone like St. John of the Cross, that they can become enlightened despite the fact that they are just kind of stuck in a tradition that doesn't have the same concepts, and they've got to really kind of become enlightened, partly just in spite of the system, so to speak. Well, I'm just going to move on to the second half of this question from Dhamma River. He says, asks if I think the Bodhisattva vow hinders or helps sincere practitioners of the Noble Eightfold Path. I would say it's more of a hindrance than a help, just because it's just superfluous, it's unnecessary. But, I mean, it takes all kinds. There are some personality types, maybe they're more devotionalistic or idealistic or something, that may be benefited by the Bodhisattva vow. But, I mean, the Bodhisattva vow is, I mean, how would you even remember if you took the vow in a previous life? There's a good chance, if there is rebirth, and I'm willing to accept the possibility of that I've taken a Bodhisattva vow in some previous birth. Maybe I was Japanese hundreds of years ago, was a Mahayana Buddhist, and took a Bodhisattva vow, and I don't recall it now. According to the Diamond Cutter Sutra, I am a Bodhisattva, because according to the Diamond Cutter Sutra, anyone who reads the Diamond Cutter Sutra and is not filled with dread but actually likes it has got to be a Bodhisattva, and I like it. I don't feel any dread at all when I read the Diamond Cutter Sutra. But does the Bodhisattva vow hinder or help? Yeah, I would guess it's more of a hindrance than a help. I mean, it's like dedicating yourself like into the indefinite future to strive to be this mythological Sammasambuddha type being. And I mean, that is just largely mythology, in my opinion. I mean, the Buddha taught you should strive to become enlightened in this very life, if at all possible, which does not require any Bodhisattva vow at all. The Bodhisattva vow is just more likely to get in the way of that. And if you take the Bodhisattva vow seriously, it's just bad math, bad logic. You know, this samsara presumably has existed forever already, no beginning. And there's still an infinite number of unenlightened beings, which does seem to indicate that there will never be a situation in which all beings are liberated. Gautama Buddha did not succeed in liberating all beings, did he? So I think I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Ethiopian Fake Tig. An Ethiopian Fake Tig says, there is a sutta where the Buddha talks about how ugly the body is, and many monks off themselves cause of it. And when the Buddha came back, he calmed them down by doing a breath meditation. Speak on this if you can. And there may be a sutta version of this. There probably is, now that I think of it. But originally it comes from the rules of monastic discipline. One of the Parajika rules, the rule against killing, murder, is to deliberately cause the death of another human being, even by just talking them into self-deletion, is a Parajika offense entailing excommunication from the Sangha for life. So there's this elaborate story where the Buddha was giving talks about just not so much the ugliness, but just the impurity and sort of vileness, the loathsomeness of the human body. And then when monks were meditating on this, they were becoming so repulsed by their own body that they wanted to self-delete. And then there was this monk who just volunteered, well, okay, I'll help anyone who wants to self-delete or just wants to be deleted, I'll do it for you. And so there was this monk that was going around essentially deleting other monks. And so when the Buddha came out of his like solitary retreat in the forest, or I don't recall the story completely because it's been years since I read it and I didn't get around to reading it again before answering this. That he first of all, he made it a rule saying, no, you should not kill other people even if they want to be deleted. And let's see, he said, really, you shouldn't want to die before you're enlightened anyway. And so he taught them like the breath, meditation on the breath, which, is calming and doesn't cause so much revulsion as just meditating on the foulness of the human body. Although meditating on the foulness of the human body still is a legitimate, like orthodox meditation of Theravada Buddhism, but it's not practiced nearly as much as like mindfulness of breathing, for example. But I can't give the exact details. But I mean, if you look it up online, it's in Vinaya. Probably there's a sutta version of it also, but I read it in Vinaya with regard to the third parajika. So if you look up like a translation of the Vinaya Pitaka, which is available free online, you can download the entire thing for free, and then just read the origin story of the third parajika, and it'll have the full story there. So I'm just moving on to Ethiopian fake Tig's next question. Did the women that ordained during the time of the Buddha all become enlightened? And also, who is the most well-known bhikkhuni from the Buddha's time or closer to his time? So that's two questions, isn't it? That's two question marks. So did the women that ordained during the time of the Buddha all become enlightened? No, they didn't. I mean, why would they be different from the men? All the men didn't become enlightened either. For example, among the men, you had the notorious group of 6 monks who are mentioned again and again in Vinaya because they were misbehaving in various ways, which was responsible, according to the tradition, for the Buddha to be making more and more rules, because this group of 6 monks were continually just messing around and doing the wrong thing. And it turned out that, they had their mirror images as the group of 6 nuns who were getting into trouble like the group of 6 monks were. Some of the rules for bhikkhunis were caused by this group of 6 nuns doing exactly the same thing as the group of 6 monks did. And sometimes the group of 6 nuns and the group of 6 monks would get together and they would make new trouble. There was one rule against, let's see, I think one of the group of 6 nuns pretended like she was pregnant to get somebody else in trouble. So, she wasn't enlightened. The group of 6 nuns in general weren't enlightened. There was, as a general rule, the majority aren't going to become enlightened even in the Buddhist time. They're still going to be just like deadwood in the Sangha. And in the Bhikkhuni Sangha as well. So, yeah, the answer to this question, did the women that ordained during the time of the Buddha all become enlightened? The answer is no. And so the second part of this question, which is kind of a transgressive double question. See, who is the most well-known bhikkhuni from the Buddhist time or closer to his time? Probably the most well-known bhikkhuni would be the first bhikkhuni, who would be Mahapajapati Gautami, who was the Buddha's stepmother and aunt. The Buddha's father married 2 sisters, and the Buddha's mother died when he was a baby, but Mahapajapati Gautami was sort of like his foster mother, his stepmother, also his biological aunt. And she wanted to be the first nun. She wanted the Buddha to ordain nuns, to start an order of nuns so she could become a nun. And at first he's just saying, nope, not going to do it, not going to do it, until finally she was just following him around with like dust in her hair and her face streaming with tears, just standing in silence, outside his door all the time, just kind of wanting to be a nun, kind of protesting in a way. And then Ananda talks the Buddha into ordaining her, mainly through the argument that Ananda said, well, can't women become enlightened like men can become enlightened? And the Buddha had to agree, yeah, women can become enlightened too. So then Ananda talks him into starting an order of nuns. And of course, notoriously, infamously, the Buddha said, all right, but now you've done it. Because of this, the true Dhamma will last only half as long. Instead of lasting 1,000 years, it'll only last 500 years because of ordaining nuns. But Mahapajapati Gautami was the Buddha's aunt and stepmother and the very first bhikkhuni. So she's the most famous, I'm sure. There's some other famous bhikkhunis, like Ambapali. She offered the Buddha one of his last meals. She was a courtesan, like an expensive prostitute. the Padesa Kalyani, I think she was called. It was the beauty of the land, who would be hired by like city councils to entertain VIPs in town, that kind of thing. And she became a nun. I mean, she offered the Buddha one of his last meals, and then his discourse to her, I think, inspired her to stop being a courtesan, and she renounced worldly life and became a nun. And her verses in the Therigatha are some of the most poetic and well-known verses in the Therigatha. Ambapali's verses, comparing how beautiful she used to be with, the unavoidable ravages of time. That's kind of the theme of her verses. Also, there's like Vajira was a Buddhist, an enlightened Buddhist nun. She's got a famous sutta in the Samyutta Nikaya, the Sagata Wagga of the Sutta Nikaya, I'm pretty sure. There's a group of suttas all following the same theme, where some enlightened nun goes out into the forest to meditate, and then Mara tries to lead her astray by seeding her mind with doubts. And so I think the Vajira Sutta is one of the places where you find the simile of the chariot to account for the idea of no self. So that's a relatively famous sutta with a relatively famous nun, enlightened nun in it. But all in all, Mahapajapati Gautami, the Buddha's aunt and stepmother, the very first bhikkhuni, would probably be the most famous bhikkhuni of all time. And then Ethiopian fake Tig includes like a transgressive fourth question, because the second question was really two questions. He says, have you ever met an Ethiopian before? Or would you ever travel to Ethiopia with your sweetheart for fun times? That's also two questions, isn't it? Ethiopian fake Tig's name is going on a list. So, have I ever met an Ethiopian before? I don't think so. I mean, there's a famous Ethiopian chef that I've seen on cooking shows, cooking competition shows. He's got like a Swedish name because he was adopted by a Swedish family, I think. He's an expert on Swedish cooking, but ethnically he's Ethiopian, I'm pretty sure. I've walked past Ethiopian restaurants that may have had real Ethiopians inside of it, but I never had any urge to eat Ethiopian food, because back in the 80s, you think about Ethiopia and you think about like standing in line with like a dented tin cup to get milk powder or something. No offense to Ethiopians. I hope they've got their food issues worked out nowadays. But back in the 80s, it was just, this, when you wouldn't eat your vegetables, a parent would say, children are starving in Ethiopia. So I'm not aware of having met an Ethiopian before. I may have without realizing, but I'm not sure about that. And would I ever travel to Ethiopia with my sweetheart for fun times? When you think about Ethiopia, you generally don't think about going there for fun times. There's any number of places that if I were going to go somewhere with my sweetheart for fun times, they would come to mind as like a viable idea long before I would go to Ethiopia. Probably really good coffee in Ethiopia, but yeah, I don't think it's very likely. And now that there's like aquariums and stuff here, we're more kind of chained to the house, less able to do a lot of traveling than before, when all we had was dogs and maybe a cat. So, would I ever travel to Ethiopia with my sweetheart for fun times? Probably not. I wouldn't go to Somalia either. I mean, you could sort of go to both places in the same trip, kill two birds with one stone, so to speak. If you'll forgive the violent non-Buddhist metaphor, but still, I mean, there's places closer to home that I would think might be more fun than Ethiopia. So, I'm just going to move on to the next question. And we are kind of getting down towards the bottom of the scroll here. So, definitely less than 3 hours. This question is from Fifth. And Fifth says, in a book I'm reading about Ajahn Chah, there is a reference to Ajahn Mun using betel nut. What effect does this have on one's ability to meditate or advance on a Buddhist path? This, along with nicotine and kratom, seems to be very popular in Southeast Asia. Are there differing stigmas to the use of each substance there? Are two former more accepted than the latter simply because monks of that fame use them? I'm going to attempt to get off nicotine myself, as I've been using it for the last 10 years since I was 16. Okay, kratom, I never encountered any use of kratom when I was in Southeast Asia. People maybe were taking it. It just wasn't a mainstream thing. It was kind of a secret thing, maybe like a low status thing that people were ashamed of or something. Or maybe I just did not travel in those circles. But tobacco and betel nut are common. In fact, in the city of Metila in central Burma, that was the only place where I would go for alms as a monk. And some people would put betel quids into my bowl as alms because a lot of monks chew betel there. So I did, let's sort of experiment. I tried it to see what it was like. And you get kind of a mild stimulant buzz, kind of. It's kind of similar to how you'd feel if you smoked about half a cigar or something. But yeah, I would not want to chew betel regularly because it's not really that good for you. It grinds all the enamel off your teeth. And a lot of these Burmese village guys, it's hard to tell if they had teeth at all because when you chew betel, your saliva like chemically interacts with the contents of the betel quid. I think it's mostly it's like some kind of lime that is mixed with the betel nut. And it causes your slobber to turn into like ketchup. And then these village guys, they chew betel all the time and they don't brush their teeth. So it's like their mouth is like the top of an old ketchup bottle at like a cheap diner where it's just sort of like this reddish black crust all over the inside of their mouth. And it smells, has like this vinegary smell, and it just looks disgusting. And it grinds the enamel off your teeth, like I mentioned. So yeah, I didn't want to take a lot of betel. I did try it just to see what it was like. I did smoke a few Burmese hand-rolled cigars too. You have to excuse me if you're watching, because what happens is I've got like oily skin on my face and my eyelids, and after many hours of not taking a shower, I took one when I got up this morning or this early afternoon. It's like the eyelid grease starts to like burn my eyes, so then I have to wipe them off or take a shower or something. But anyways, getting back to betel nut and cigarettes, tobacco, there's not really much of a stigma on chewing betel or smoking tobacco. One of my main teachers in Burma, Tampulu Chaltsin Doya Siyato, chewed betel nut. And one of the old monks I used to live with, the one that got bitten by a cobra and died, he chewed betel nut even though he had only like 4 teeth left in his head, and also smoked cigars, like the cheap hand-rolled village cigars. Usually they would be wrapped in some kind of leaf that wasn't a tobacco leaf, or sometimes in corn husk. It's maybe a very slight idea that it's not appropriate in Burma, but in Thailand, it's just 100% A-okay, because as Fifth mentions, Ajahn Mun not only used betel nut, but he was a chain smoker, or at least I have heard that he was a chain smoker. And since Ajahn Mun is considered by Thai monks or Thai Buddhists to be an arahant, then if Ajahn Mun did it, it must be okay. And that's one reason why the Thais also eat cheese in the afternoon, not because it's likely to be allowable. Pretty obviously isn't allowable. It's eating food in the afternoon, but Ajahn Mun did it, and so it's okay. I mean, there's some of that kind of stuff in Burma too. Like, I was ordained in the Tampulu tradition, and for whatever reasons, Tampulu Siyato just said, okay, dawn is at, I can't remember the exact time. It was really early in the morning, like 4 in the morning. So just throughout the year, he just officially, dawn is 4 in the morning and you can eat after that time. And I would refuse, and I got some heat from monks in the Tampulu tradition, just saying, it's a Tampulu Siyato. He's like our spiritual father. He said it's okay. It's like, well, if I don't see any light in the sky, I'm not going to say it's daytime. Just hard-headed barbarian. So, let's see. What's the actual question here? Are there differing stigmas to the use of each substance there? Yeah, I think kratom would be more of a stigma than chewing betel or smoking tobacco. I mean, the really strict monks in Burma won't even drink tea because there's an obscure rule of Vinaya saying that you can drink the juice of all leaves except for the leaf or the water that is drained off of boiled pot herbs. Like you boil spinach, you get some greenish water. It's against the rules to drink that because that would be sort of like soup, which would be like food. And so there's a rule against that. And then in Burma, tea leaves are eaten as a salad. And it's actually good. Tea leaf salad. It's lepet, it's called in Burmese. I mean, it's actually really good. I wouldn't mind getting my hands on some of that here in America. Just like pickled tea leaf salad with like sesame seeds and stuff in it. It's really good. But because of that, it's considered to be a kind of salad or, like edible greens. And so when you cook you steep the tea leaves in hot water, that's like the water drained off of pot herbs. So that really strict Burmese monks, of whom there are not a whole lot, but there are some, they won't even drink tea because of that. And probably they wouldn't chew betel or smoke tobacco either, even though technically there's no rule against it, partly because it just wasn't a thing in the Ganges Valley in the Buddhist time. If there was tobacco plants growing in the Ganges Valley in the Buddha time, almost certainly the Buddha would have prohibited it because, of course, craving is the cause of all suffering, and tobacco is addictive, which causes craving. Anyways, let's see. Are the two former more accepted than the latter simply because monks of that fame use them? Yeah, especially in Thailand. So, okay, I think I answered that one. So I'm just going to answer Fifth's second question. He said, when first moving to Burma, what things gave you the most culture shock? So this is kind of like the mirror image of the question above by Romeo, I think, asking me, what kind of culture shock did I get when coming back from Burma to America after so many years? But when moving to Burma, what things gave me the most culture shock? First of all, I didn't speak the language. I knew very little Burmese when I first got there. So it's, all of a sudden, you just can't communicate very well. That was kind of a culture shock. I mean, it was like when I was going for alms at first, before I learned how to speak the Burmese language, you were kind of like a dog. It's like dogs listen more to your tone of voice than what you're actually saying. So, if I'm walking for alms and somebody says blah, blah, blah in sort of a cheerful, happy kind of voice, it generally means, generally they were saying, Yetomu Baumpea, Yetomu Baumpea, which means, please wait, Venerable Sir. They see the monk walking by, they want to offer food, so they say, please wait, so they can run into the house and get you something. But then if they say the blah, blah, blah in sort of like a slower downbeat kind of a voice, they're saying, Godol Zumbapia. That means, I pay my respect as alms, which means I'm not going to give you any food. So it's just, at first, you become like a dog, and it's like you're just kind of tuning in on the tone of voice to determine whether they want to give you food or they don't want to give you food, that kind of thing. See, what gave me the most culture shock? I mean, just being in a different culture, the very conservative Buddhist culture was different from being in America as a layperson. But the thing is, I was living in like a Burmese cultural center for over a year and a half before I went to Burma. So, I mean, it was all, Burmese monks and Burmese supporters, that kind of thing. In California, where I was staying, there was only one other Western monk who was ordained at the same time as me. He was Argentinian. And most of the supporters, all the other monks are Burmese. Oh, there was one Vietnamese monk also. But, so So, I mean, it wasn't really a culture shock with regard to that because I was already exposed to Burmese culture and Burmese language and so forth, even though I didn't learn it yet. There's one interesting thing. When I first got to Burma in Rangoon, all the taxi cabs were blue B600. It was like Mazda B600 pickups. And the B600 meant it had a 600cc engine. It probably couldn't go faster than about 30 or 35 miles an hour. It was floored. All bright blue. They're these tiny little pickup trucks about the size of a Volkswagen Beetle. But that didn't really give me culture shock, but it was remarkable to me. It really stood out in my memory. Yeah, I mean, it wasn't so much culture shock as just largely at first just heat, just tropical blazing heat was like the hardest thing to get used to. And of course, you get Montezuma's revenge or King Thibault's revenge for my first 4 months or more in Burma. So that was kind of a internal shock, I suppose. But yeah, I was already exposed to like Burmese culture even long before I went to Burma, just because I was ordained in a Burmese monastery. So that probably softened the blow to some degree. I really can't think of anything else that would cause serious culture shock other than just suddenly landing in a country where you cannot communicate with people. At first, I was communicating in like broken Pali to one other monk at the monastery who had had some schooling and knew some Pali. His vocabulary was better than mine, I think, but I was better at verb tenses than him. So let's see here. I think I'm just going to move on to Fifth's third question, which is, have you had any updates on that former monk friend living on the outskirts of that industrial park in Burma, the one who I believe lived in a tree? No, I haven't heard from him in about a year. I mean, I just heard about him, just sort of an update from the person that was largely taking care of him, letting him stay on his property, that kind of thing. So yeah, there's no updates since probably a year or more. And so I'm just moving on to Joe Doe, who is the last questioner, and he has asked 2 questions. So the first question from Joe Doe, did you ever have a direct experience of emptiness? And I mean, emptiness, it's how do you define emptiness? Like, for example, one of my favorite suttas in the Majjhima Nikaya is the smaller discourse on emptiness. And there's like this gradation of stages of emptiness that the monk goes through. The first stage of emptiness is just moving out of a town or village into a forest. That's like the first step towards emptiness, because at least it's empty of all these artificial rules and all these straight lines and right angles and so forth. It's getting out away from other people. So it's sort of sociologically empty anyway. And then you start getting into deeper and deeper meditative states. And I mean, through meditative states, you can't even get to full emptiness. So, I mean, like in the sutta, the lesser or small discourse on emptiness, the Chula Sunyata Sutta, I mean, eventually you get to the signless concentration of mind, which by implication is higher than even 4th jhana. It's higher than any jhana. You've gotten into this signless, this wide open concentration of mind. But even that isn't purely empty, because there's still like this perception going on. And so what happens is the monk comes out of that, and then he has this insight that arises. It's like, even when I attained the highest possible meditative state, it was still conditioned. It still had a beginning and an end. That is not what I'm striving for. And so it's like something just kind of clicks, and the monk just kind of gives up. He just lets go of samsara at that point. And then with full enlightenment, which he becomes fully enlightened, and then perhaps he has a direct experience of emptiness. So, I mean, I had like relative direct experiences of emptiness. I got into some relatively deep meditative states where your mind is just wide open and clear like glass. That would be as close to a direct experience of emptiness that I experienced. But still, it was conditioned, it had a beginning and an end. The thing is, though, I mean, we're always having a direct experience of ultimate reality. It's just that, like Eckhart Tolle says, our mind is making too much noise so we don't notice. But it's always there. So you're always having like a subliminal direct experience of emptiness, even if you don't fully realize this at a conscious level. And so I'm just going to move on to Jodo's second question, which is the last question of this Q&A. And Jodo says, does the mind exist in ultimate truth? And I mean, I've already kind of answered this question. I mean, starting off with Orthodox Theravada, yes, the answer would be yes. In Abhidhamma philosophy, there are 4 ultimate realities. You've got, I held up 5 fingers when I said 4 ultimate realities. 4 ultimate realities. You've got mind, mental states. Let's see. Mind, mental states, matter, physical matter, and Nibbāna. So, according to Abhidhamma philosophy, the mind exists in ultimate truth even if you're unenlightened. But mind and mental states are chitta and cetasika. That's 2 entirely different realities. So the mind is ultimately real, and each mental state, like a perception or a volition or a sensation, is also ultimately real. And so they combine together and you have this multiplicity of psychological events going on. But in my personal opinion, does the mind exist in ultimate truth? You just get to consciousness. I'd say that consciousness is ultimately real. The mental states are just forms of consciousness. Like, I mean, I'm saying the same stuff over and over and over again in these Q&As. It's like just going with the analogy of if consciousness is like water, then mental states are like ripples on the surface of the water. This is not Orthodox Theravada. This is my understanding, which seems to me to make a hell of a lot better sense. So you've got consciousness is the water. Mental states are like the ripples and currents on this water. And so the form, I mean, really, it's just water. You know, like a wave of water. Ultimately, it's just water. It's just an arbitrary choice to perceive, to isolate this particular form. And if that makes any sense. But then again, when you become enlightened, supposedly, I mean, the consciousness or the mind becomes unmanifest. It goes off the scale and you can't say whether it exists or doesn't exist or both or neither. So to recap my answer to that, from the Orthodox Theravada Buddhist point of view, certainly the mind exists in ultimate truth, as does physical matter, all the different mental states, of which there are 52 different kinds, 28 different kinds of matter, and then you've got one kind of consciousness, even though Abhidhamma then kind of divides it up into subtypes or something, and then you've got, what's the one I didn't mention yet? Nibbāna. So from the Orthodox Theravada point of view, yes, the mind exists in ultimate truth. From my point of view, my understanding, based on my own experience and intuition and insight and so forth, then you can say the mind, I mean, God, I mean, when you get to ultimate truth, you can't say anything. See, that's the thing. It becomes unmanifest and goes off the scale. But if anything does exist, it would just be like pure formless consciousness. Within mind and consciousness are like synonyms, or at least chitta and vijnana are synonyms in Theravada Buddhist philosophy. But when you become fully enlightened, when you reach the level of paramata satcha, or ultimate truth, I mean, it just becomes infinite and formless and goes off the scale, and you can't say whether it exists or doesn't exist, or both or neither. So that's it, I guess. I think I'm done answering questions for this particular episode. And so, like I should always say at the beginning, and pretty much never do, if you have any questions you think I can answer regarding early Buddhism, Theravada Buddhism, Dharma, in general, meditation, monastic discipline, Southeast Asia, that kind of stuff, then feel free to ask. I cannot promise that I'll be able to answer satisfactorily, but at least I'll give it a shot if the question is asked in good earnest, in good faith. And like and subscribe if you have not done so already. Feel free to leave comments, that sort of thing. And what else should I say before I say be happy? Oh, I just said it. So I guess I'll just hit the button. Oh, look at the URL links listed below this video, and that includes the books that I've written. And there may actually be another book coming up, because even if I don't finish it before I find a more suitable job than the one I had before, at the very least, I'm not going to be working 55-hour weeks and just coming home exhausted and just spending my weekends like resting for the next week of aggravation and stress. So now I'm really going to hit the button.